So now we're going to be covering Armies and Tactics Phillips II's Cavalry and Siegecraft video.
In our previous video, we talked about the Macedonian infantry of Philip II. In this episode, we will cover the changes he made to the Macedonian cavalry and siege equipment. The Macedonian cavalry had a rich history, as the region was ideal for breeding fine war horses. The Macedonian horsemen were considered some of the greatest in the central Mediterranean long before Philip. Their riders came from the Macedonian nobility. They were called the Companions, or Hetairoi, to emphasize their closeness to the king. Contrary to some beliefs, it was not Philip who created the title Companions. It had been in use long before 359 BC. We hear of the Companions' prowess in battle against larger enemy cavalry units both during the Peloponnesian War and the Spartan-Olynthian War. So Philip inherited a rich equestrian tradition among his elites. Yet many of these nobles had perished alongside Philip's elder brother Perdiccas fighting against the Illyrians in 359 BC, and it appears that Philip did not have a large surviving cavalry force available. He quickly solved this by promoting many of his supporters to the Macedonian nobility, thus making them companions. Soon after, Thessalians and other Greeks were also incorporated into the nobility to further increase numbers. The companions' primary weapon was a lance called the xyston. Around 2 meters in length, the xyston's shaft was made from cornel wood, similar to the infantry sarissa. Yet unlike the sarissa, the xyston was wielded with one hand due to its lighter weight and smaller size. At its end was a stout iron tip designed to penetrate both armor and flesh. The companions were also equipped with a short sword, either a kopis or xiphos, in case the xyston shaft broke on impact. For their armor, the companions were equipped with a cuirass made of either bronze or leather. They were also armed with metal greaves and a gorget, both usually made of bronze. Their helmet was the famed Phrygian helmet, made of iron. Later, around the time of Alexander's succession, it appears this helmet style was replaced by the more suitable Boeotian style. Scholars debate whether Philip's companions also had a small shield like the pelter of his infantrymen. Whether this is the case or not, it appears it was discarded by the time of Alexander's crossing into Asia in 334 BC. Philip arranged his companion cavalry into squadrons called elae. Each squadron consisted of around 200 men and were based on the Macedonian districts where the companions owned their land. Among these squadrons was an elite 300-strong squadron called the Basilike elae, the Royal Squadron. The greatest reform Philip made to his companions was in their training. The companions were to be the shock arm of his army, meant to disrupt an enemy's line and shatter their resolve with the power of their charge. So they were trained to fight in a special formation, the wedge. The wedge had been traditionally used among the Scythians and Thracians.
Yeah, this formation was always meant, just to break lines you can kind of see. Also the diamond formation, which the Thessalonian cavalry was known for, as a thing. So yeah, it's cool to see this because, I always heard about like the Thessalonian cavalry being the best, and even the Macedonian cavalry, the companions, being some of the greatest cavalry, in military history. So it's cool kind of seeing it because I never really looked too deep into it, which I just find very interesting in this video,
It was triangular, with one rider at the front and the number increasing in each row further back. The squadron commander would lead the wedge, as that was the most visible and easiest position to guide the rest of the formation. In a solid wedge, each squadron of 200 men would be 20 men deep and 20 men wide at its base. The wedge could be hollow, which would give the formation a greater size. Combined with the use of the Zisten lance, the wedge formation was devastating. The narrowness of its head meant that the leading horse could exploit and charge through even small gaps in an enemy line. Those behind would follow, and very quickly the opposing formation would be shattered, which the following infantry would exploit. Philip knew that if used correctly, the shock element of his new-look companions trained in the wedge formation would be devastating. Yet the wedge was not faultless in its design. Despite all the training, and no matter how formidable the Macedonian steeds were, the wedge would only prove devastating if there was a gap in the enemy lines for the horse to charge through. A horse would never charge into a solid, unbroken infantry phalanx standing its ground. Instead, it would shy away and refuse to run into a cohesive line of spears. If the wedge was to be effective, the enemy formation had to first be disrupted and gaps created. This is what his new-look infantry was for. Armed with lines of deadly sarissæ, the offensive power of the Macedonian phalanx, supported by both archers and javelinmen, was perfect for shattering the cohesion of enemy formations. Being also under fire from both javelins and arrows, their foe would struggle to oppose the sarissæ with the shorter length of their own weapons. Unable to counter, the enemy formation would soon suffer casualties and lose its cohesion. Gaps would emerge, and it was these gaps that the companions would exploit in the wedge. It was this tactic that scholars believe Philip used to gain his first great victory against the Illyrians in 357 BC. His son Alexander would famously use the wedge to exploit the gap in Darius's line at Gaugamela. Philip would also develop the hammer and anvil tactic, used most effectively.
Yeah, I've heard about the hammer and anvil tactic, mainly being, kind of the phalanxes was meant to hold the enemy in place while the cavalry went around, hammer and anvil. Kind of really does explain the relationship between the phalanx and the cavalry, and that's the thing about Philip's army. It needs that two-front battle. It needs great cavalry and the phalanx. Like, it's almost like a double thing, the hammer and the anvil combined perfect, So, yeah, it is cool to see, just how important the cavalry was in addition to the phalanx itself.
By his son Alexander and many other commanders since. We will talk about this tactic in more detail in a separate documentary. The companion cavalry were designed to fight in unison with the infantry to gain victory. Neither unit was more important, both were indispensable. However, the companions were not the only Macedonian cavalry force reformed by Philip. Alongside the heavy cavalry, Philip introduced a new, lighter unit called the prodromoi, literally meaning the runners ahead. The prodromoi were the lighter complement to the companions. Unlike the companions, they wore tunics and the traditional Macedonian hat called the kawisa. It appears the prodromoi served in a variety of roles, and their primary weapon depended on that. Primarily, they served as scouts and would have been armed with javelins and acted as swift skirmishers. These javelins would be used to inflict the first casualties in a battle from a distance. Later, we also hear of the prodromoi being referred to as sarissaphoroi, or sarissa-bearing cavalry. This suggests the prodromoi could also serve as lancer cavalry, used primarily against enemy horsemen. At the Battle of Gaugamela, for example, we hear of sarissaphoroi routing the opposing Persian cavalry. Although their name suggests otherwise, the sarissaphoroi lance was shorter than that of the sarissa infantry. It would have been too cumbersome for the rider to carry. Instead, they were armed with longer versions of the Zisten lance, still held with one hand. Just as with the companions, Philip divided the prodromoi into elay squadrons and trained them in the wedge formation. Philip also saw great potential in the development and reform of another area of military warfare, and his reign would mark the beginning of a new epoch in siege warfare. Philip had a keen interest in using siege machinery to aid him in capturing cities, most notably at Amphipolis in 357 BC, where he used both battering rams and siege engines to breach the enemy's walls. Seeing its effectiveness, it was probably not long after this that Philip created his own special engineering corps within his reformed army, tasked with constructing various siege engines such as siege towers, battering rams, and catapults. Once again, we do not know for certain, but scholars presume the headquarters of this corps was in Pella, which likely soon became an arsenal for military machinery. The engineering corps quickly became a critical part of Philip's army, and they soon got used to constructing and operating various siege engines. One such engine was the Oxybeles. The Oxybeles was an improvement on the Gastrophites mechanical bow that had originated in Sicily at the start of the 4th century BC. Its mechanical bow remained the same as the Gastrophites, but it differed by mounting onto solid frames. Non-torsion winches were used to push back the bow's arms to give it more power. As a result, it could fire bolts up to 300 yards. Although the Oxybeles was not created in Macedon, it was quickly brought there by Philip to aid his siege warfare. Evidence suggests that Philip used the Oxybeles during his siege of Olynthus in 348 BC, and continued to use them throughout his reign. Philip's engineering corps would make advancements to siege warfare due mainly to one man. Polyidus, a Thessalian, was Philip's chief engineer for much of his reign. Once again, our evidence is limited, but it appears Polyidus made significant improvements to both the ram and siege tower, increasing their protection and maneuverability. Yet Polyidus's greatest achievement was his creation of the torsion catapult. Prior to 350 BC, catapults such as the Gastrophites and Oxybeles were non-tension and fired arrows against defenders on the wall rather than the walls themselves. Polyidus would make significant improvements. In around 340 BC, he developed torsion springs and supporting frames for the catapults. These springs gave the catapult a much greater propulsive power than the Oxybeles, and allowed it to fire projectiles at enemies from up to 300 meters away. These torsion catapults could also be placed on top of siege engines, from where they could fire down on defenders. They were called Catapultae Macedonicoi, or Macedonian catapults, as Philip and Polyidus were the first to develop them. Philip would use these new machines during the siege of Byzantium in 340 BC, although the siege, in the end, would prove unsuccessful. Polyidus's importance to Macedonia—
Holy crap, I did not know about Polyidus. Man's an engineering genius. You know, like I said, I did know about the phalanx and the cavalry, obviously, about Philip's reforms, but man, I did not know about the siegecraft. I think that's the part I was looking most forward to in this video. And yeah, you can just see, like, genius, like, just the machinery, the catapults, the, siege towers, putting the catapults on the siege towers. That's just cool, man. Like, I think, like, seeing kind of how oddly advanced it is. I mean, obviously when we think over 2,000 years ago, we don't think of like super advanced things, but just seeing that like sketched out is just super cool. It really puts into perspective just a great reformer, how great of a reformer Philip II was, and how he created like the greatest army in the world at that point,
Siege developments cannot be understated. We will discuss the changes made to siege warfare by Alexander and the Diadochi in the future, but it should be noted that those developments were built on the shoulders of Philip and Polyidus. During his reign, Philip had completely revolutionized Hellenic warfare. Infantry, cavalry, and machinery, he had reformed all. The days of heavily armed phalanxes being the dominant factor in war were over. A new era in armies and tactics had begun. His son, Alexander, would be sure to take advantage of these changes, so subscribe and press the alarm bell to learn about Alexander's army in our future videos. Our videos are made possible.
Okay, that was cool. I really like that. The Siegecraft section is what really amazed me the most. Alright, so the next few videos, we're going to jump to the military reforms of Alexander and what he did to build on what his father did. So I'm going to jump to that. I'll see you guys tomorrow when we cover that. Bye, everyone.